We'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Vimala Ramachandran. Dr. Vimala's areas of work include elementary education, girls' education, and women's empowerment. She was involved in the conceptualization of Mahila Samakhya and served as the first national project director from 1988 to 93. Ma'am will be joining us virtually. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can. You're audible.
Thank you very much, Flame University, for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't come because I had a bad asthma attack. Let me start by saying that Subir was spot on. He has identified some of the key systemic issues, and more importantly, our inability to learn from past mistakes, and reinventing the wheel by each new bureaucrat or head of the education system. In particular, the education system is the beast that we are living with, a beast that we don't understand. I live in Rajasthan, which is actually
Recording in progress.
I live in Rajasthan, which is really a graveyard of innovations. There were so many innovations from the early 1980s in both women's development and education and even rural development. But the principle that the bureaucracy followed was undo what my predecessor did. And each bureaucrat wanted to leave his own personal legacy rather than actually bringing about systemic change. Well, what I'm going to say is going to complement what Subir's excellent analysis. And I'm very sorry if I'm going to be saying a few things which I've said over the last 25 years. Since my first engagement with schools, teachers, administrators in the 1980s, I realized that there was a huge gap between intentions spelled out in policies and projects and work plans and the reality on the ground. The system has been very person-centric and officer-centric. And of course, there are discernible state-wise differences. Some states were formally rule-bound, but in reality function through an informal network of patronage, conventions, and also rent-seeking. And this was embedded within a social hierarchical system where the location, caste, community, economic situation, gender, all these things actually worked together to actually define what the system was actually like on the ground. Some states were more particular about enforcement of rules on the ground. As a result, teachers and school heads and administrators were not necessarily trapped in the web of patronage and rent seeking. Examples being Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka. In fact, there are 3 books which really go into this in detail. One is the more recent book by Akshay Mangala, Making Bureaucracies Work. The other one is the book Rashmi and I did in 2009 called Elementary Education System in India. And the 2018 book on the Teacher Workforce Study, done through NEPA. The second discernible difference I find between states is the level of engagement of local people in the provision of services, including education and not only education. There is very little room for schools not opening at all or not having any teachers or midday meals not being served in some states. But in some states, you know that this is a common practice, that schools will have no teachers, teachers won't come, or midday meal would be served erratically. The third very important thing is the culture of transfers and postings, where the education bureaucracy is very closely aligned to the political system. And the fourth very important issue has been the whole notion of proxy teachers. And this is a very serious issue, especially in the Northeast. and in many other Central and North Indian countries. I'm sorry, because of our asthma, I'm coughing. A trend was very clear from the mid-1980s, or even as Subir says, from 1990s, that families want to educate their children across South, West, East, North, everywhere. As a result, from 1990s onwards, there was a huge mushrooming of private schools in both rural areas and urban areas. Yes, some North, Central and Eastern states lagged behind for a short while, but they all caught on by mid-1990s. I vividly recall Dr. Sharda Jain telling me that the tragedy is not that the people do not want to educate their children. The tragedy is that the government is not willing to or able to respond to these needs of the people. And some of the reasons Subir actually pointed to. I'd like to talk about a few things which actually led a very deep systemic impact on our system. Many of you will recall the Shiksha Karmi project that was designed in 1984. Many rural and remote schools had no teachers, or if they were appointed, they rarely showed up in schools. The raison d'etre of SKP was to address teacher truancy and resort to locally hired teachers, along with a very strong teacher training system which was localized. But what happened? As DPEP came, government discovered that having teachers on contract is actually financially very viable. And there are many educationists, maybe even sitting in the hall, who have been arguing for paying less to teachers. And this actually led to a very, very sharp decline in not only the motivation of teachers, but the respect for teachers in the community at large. These innovations, along with other innovation, which is creating an autonomous society under the Societies Registration Act of 1860, to manage Shiksha Karmi Board, which later on became the DPEP Society and SSA Society, effectively split our education system into two. There was the mainframe and there was this bypassed system which was working. Officers like Anil Bodia were very happy working with the bypassed system, and they made very little effort to actually change the main education system. So for all the beautiful things that SKP, Shiksha Karmi and Lok Jumbish did, or for that matter DPEP did, it did not actually inform the main education system. I'd like to move on to another point which Subir pointed to. Our system since the 1980s has been plagued by segregation and hierarchies. We started off with NFE and alternative schools, then later on EGS schools. Now we have single teacher schools. We have Dravida Welfare Board schools, Tribal Welfare Board schools, effectively providing poorer quality education in some of these schools while providing better quality education in schools like Kendriya Vidyalaya. So as the system got more and more segregated, it started reflecting the social structure of our society. When I was a child, I went to government school throughout, from class 1 to class 11. I remember studying with children of all social classes. But today, the way you live, how much you earn, what community you belong to, actually determines what kind of school you go to. As a result, there is very little political will to reform the main frame of our education system. Privatization has just become a lot more visible and more powerful, notwithstanding the experience of the COVID era, when a lot of poor children who had to migrate have tried to come back to government schools. Yet they are not the elite. So we have two separate, or should I say, four separate systems. We have the private elite schools, we have the private not so elite schools, we have the government elite schools like Navodaya and Kendriya Vidyalaya, and we have the ordinary government schools. Isn't it not surprising? In fact, it is not, that majority of single and two-teacher schools are located in rural areas. And more importantly, number of schools with 0 to 1 teachers is mostly located in remote areas. Do you know there are in India 1,49,652 schools with no teachers at all? And this is according to UDICE. There are almost 50,000 single-room schools. So much for Operation Blackboard. It may be recalled that China too faced this kind of challenge of small schools. Later on, they also experienced a falling child population, and school mergers were done. But in India, when we have attempted at school mergers, we have done that in a very knee-jerk manner. And as a result, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to school mergers. One of the biggest systemic challenges we face have to do with teachers. We all recall that the Kothari Commission way back in 1965 talked about nurturing a pool of educated, highly trained teachers from every tribal community, every backward community, every backward area. Well, when we did the 9 state teacher study in NEPA, what came to light was that, notwithstanding many expert committees and reports, teacher preparation has been on the back burner. In fact, in 2003, it got privatized and the quality plummeted. And we know what happened in states like, for example, in Haryana. There were thousands of teacher training institutions in garages which were just handing out degrees. Now the question which we have asked since RTE is that, will handing over monitoring and control to local community be a solution? The obvious answer has been no. Because given the power and influence of teacher unions and unions of administrators, government employees, the village education committees actually are powerless institutions. Another very important issue that plagues us is to do with school heads. Do you know that close to 57% of schools do not have a headmaster in India? Then how are we going to manage our schools? Yes, regional differences are marked in India. The stark contrast between predominantly tribal states like Jharkhand or high poverty and high in-migration states like Assam is very important. Jharkhand has the largest proportion of single teacher schools, and Assam has the largest percentage of single classroom schools. It could be argued that one of the most important reasons for such huge regional differences has to do with the historical baggage that we carry and the culture of governance since independence. But we all know that the biggest elephant in the room is the monitoring system and the assessment system. You remember when BRCs and CRCs and even DARTs were set up as academic monitoring bodies? Today they are data collecting organizations or those wings that conduct the NAS test for NCERT. The question to ponder over is why does the government not implement the academic support system and convert it into another bureaucracy to collect data? The changing texture of equity and quality debate demands a much deeper discussion. And as Subir has pointed out, it has a lot to do with our political system. It has a lot to do with the way our governance happens and who is in power. So therefore, unless we are willing to understand the interweaving of economy, location, community, gender, parental occupation, migration, teacher status, teacher preparation, the quality of higher education, we really cannot reform the education system. Yes, Subir pointed out that many more boys are dropping out. That has a lot to do with the larger economic environment in our country. There are many more systemic issues, and I know I don't have the time, but I'm quite sure others will take up the issues related to curriculum, textbook, and pedagogy. But I would like to conclude by arguing that any systemic reform requires a 360-degree approach. As Subir said, fixing one part, one arm while ignoring the others, focusing on one level and then worrying about other levels. We were focused on primary and we said we'll worry about upper primary later. Then we said we'll worry about secondary later. This has been the bane of our education reform. We need to address from pre-primary to higher education at the same time, because it is the higher education which is a forward linkage that provides good quality teachers. And it is pre-primary education which actually prepares children to actually come into primary and actually survive through school. So tinkering with parts cannot bring about systemic change. What India needs is a thorough overhaul. And since independence, most of our great educational theorists have been talking about colonial legacy. Why did we not throw out the colonial legacy? Why did we stick to it? And why is it that even after 70 years, so many of us are just pointing to the colonial legacy? I think that is just a convenient excuse, the colonial legacy. Unless there is the change starting from ground up, pre-primary, upwards, right up to higher education, where very different arms of the education system interlock and work together, I don't think there could be any systemic reform. And the tragedy is, I do not see this roadmap even in NEP 2020. Thank you very much. I hope I've kept my time.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for sharing some really staggering statistics that will give everyone some food for thought.